cultural and linguistic competency and equity from a mental health perspective. For me, it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. J. Rocky Romero as our speaker for today. Dr. J. Rocky Romero is the CEO and owner of G.R. Romero and Associates, a training and consultant company he started almost 20 years ago. In addition, Dr. Romero is a former assistant professor for the New Mexico Highlands University School of Social Work in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He served as the co-chair for Governor Richardson in New Mexico Higher Education Department of Cultural Competency Task Force. Dr. Romero has also served as an executive council member for the New Mexico Consortium for Behavioral Health Training and Research, to include other boards and committees. In addition, Dr. Romero completed his doctoral studies at the University of New Mexico in Language, Literacy, and Sociocultural Studies, with a focus on analyzing legal discourse through a critical race theory lens. Dr. Romero has been a trainer and consultant for the National Hispanic Latino MATTC for the last 10 years. In addition, it is a national trainer for the CLARE Matrix, formerly the Matrix Institute, for the last 12 years. He is focused on culturally appropriate treatment while focusing on reducing health disparities for people of color. Lastly, Dr. Romero is focused on the intersection of racism, discrimination, and the impact of racialized legal discourse on people of color. We thank our collaborators, the community partners of South Florida, and the Florida Atlantic University College of Social Work and Criminal Justice. This presentation, I'd like to remind you that the MATTC network uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented languages in all our activities. This presentation was prepared for the National Hispanic and Latino MATTC under a cooperative agreement for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, SAMHSA. All materials appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from copyright sources, is in the public domain and may reproduce or copied without permission for SAMHSA or the authors. Citation of this source is appreciated. Do not reproduce or distribute this presentation for a fee without specific written authorization from SAMHSA or the National Hispanic and Latino MATTC. This presentation will be recorded and posted in our website. Our speakers do not declare conflict of interest. We will be doing a poll question with Cindy. So thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you, Christine. Go right ahead and read the first question. CLAS or CLAS were developed to advance health equity, improve quality, and eliminate healthcare disparities. Is a true or false question? A 100% said true. Our next question. Cultural blindness occurs when organization only meet needs of dominant group. Once again, true or false? And 89% said true, 11% said false. Our last question. Cultural competence and responsiveness are not multidimensional. Once again, true or false. And 18% said true, 82% said false. Without further ado, I'm going to leave you with Dr. Romero.
Thank you so much, Cindy and Dr. Miranda for the introduction. Hello to everybody. I'm glad to be with you all. I think most of the attendees today are coming to us from the East Coast and Florida region, so we want to say hello from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm here on Mountain Standard Time, and I'm Rocky. So, I want to start by just recognizing and appreciating, the work of the MHTTC in bringing you such diverse trainings throughout the last year for COVID. I know many of us are probably already getting tired of the Zoom trainings and conferences, so I'm hopeful that we start to get back to some normalcy. But I want to recognize the MHTTC again for also bringing to our partners these different topics that I think really help us to engage in a multidimensional way. Right. When I say multidimensional way, I mean sometimes we look at cultural awareness and cultural competency as a checkbox, and we've done those trainings. Let me check mark that, and I'm done. I'm competent. Well, we know that learning about cultures and experiences of different races is a lifelong learning process. It's a journey. It's not by any means a sprint, but a marathon. And we hope to give you guys some ideas on how to think about things differently. So when we talk about the title for today, language and literacy, and looking at that through an equity and critical race lens, I think some of the content that I'll share with you all today will definitely give you ideas on how to just think about things differently in terms of the discourse and the communication and the ways that we approach clients in our different methods. So I'm going to assume and kind of hit for right in the middle in terms of our knowledge level around our basic cultural elements. And for those of you that have not been trained or taken our cultural elements training, please reach out to us at the center. We have a plethora of different trainings that kind of give you a basis to build cultural awareness and humility on. So for today, we have about an hour and a half. I want to make sure that we spend some time at the end giving you an opportunity to ask a few questions. So I'll try to end right around 10 after, maybe 15 after the hour. We're at 1 o'clock Eastern time, 11 o'clock here in Mountain. So we'll be cognizant of that. Our learning objectives today for our time together are fivefold. Identify some basic cultural consideration for Hispanic and Latino youth and families. Describe and understand contextual meaning in language use. Know how utterances, signs, and symbols informs how clients read the world. Literacy. So sometimes when we look at, and I'll talk a little bit about bullet 3 here, just a little bit to kind of set the tone for our next hour or so, is one thing we have to really consider is thinking about literacy in a multidimensional way makes us understand that if we solely think about literacy in the sense of comprehension and reading and the way that clients are able to understand how we communicate, the literature that we share, our evidence-based practice models, those sort of things, we may miss the boat in understanding the true contextual meaning of language use and how clients come to understand the world, especially when we're talking about the Latinx population, whether that's youth or adults, as well as our elders who immigrate to this country, and or first, second, third generation. community members that we see as well. So we want to be aware that literacy, I want to really engage you and ask that you kind of keep an open mind and understanding of literacy when we talk about that. The fourth bullet here, realize how important language is in the delivery of mental health services. Language matters, in bold print, right? So language matters. The way that we approach things, the way that we talk to, about, and for clients, or the people that we represent in our community, and by our agency, representing our agency that we're employed through, we send a message to our clients, and we send a message to community members. So I really want us to think about, again, literacy and the fact that language matters. And then lastly, we want to tie a nice bow on this and really outline how we must be aware and review the class standards. And by no means are we going to look at all 15 standards today, but I want to engage you in that. And also, I'm hopeful that I can share that document with you here in just a little bit in the chat. So make sure that you're checking chat, and we'll also check the chat box also if there's questions that you all post and want to ask me as we move through this. And please, I'll stop at about 1:30 and just check in with the group and see if there's any questions. So with those objectives, I hope that we get you to a point in understanding the impact of literacy and language as it relates to mental health services. So let's talk about contextual meaning. And contextual meaning, when we look at the work of some of the authors that I'll know here in the training, and then I also want to try to share a reading list with you all. The reading list that I'll share with you is one that I typically share with groups where I do a training on institutional racism and understanding those systems and structures that perpetuate racism. I don't think that we can totally strip away racism and discrimination and how that poses mental health barriers and potentially puts clients at risk for mental health, negative mental health impact when we think about language and literacy the way that we're going to approach it. And what we have to really think about when I talk about contextual meaning is, what is the client's experience as they sit in front of you, the community members' experience as they sit in front of you, your supervisees' experience as they sit in front of you, for those of you that supervise within mental health and behavioral health services and organizations. Understand the contextual and historical meaning that has been given to words is of great significance. When we think about that in combination with literacy, we know that individuals assign meaning to their experiences. And how do they do that? Well, they assign that meaning through their way and their abilities of communicating through the language and the words, obviously, that they've learned through their experiences, not only since childhood and infancy, but into obviously elementary and junior high school experiences. So this is a collection. Think about this. It's kind of like dragging a magnet, if you will, through a bunch of bolts, and all of those bolts start to connect to that magnet, almost like a sponge absorbing water, right? It's coming to you, and as you learn these different meanings through your experience, it creates a context, and we want to pay attention to that. Second bullet here is also looking at us as service providers. I believe, depending on what code of ethics you follow, counseling, social work, psychology, or otherwise, have a duty to look beyond what's presented to us just on paper, right? When I say that, when a diagnosis comes to us, maybe pre-referral or as a referral is coming to us for a client, and they had come with a diagnosis and a set of documents that illustrates their experience and what their experiences was with the previous community-based organization, mental health provider, etc. What we have to understand is that we have to look beyond what's on that sheet of paper, and understand that the words as they pertain to self and the projection of self as it relates to others, meaning that when we see people's understanding of the contextual world that they live in, it really is kind of a microcosm, if you will, of their relation to the world, their relation to others. And at the end of the day, I firmly believe that people that seek mental health services, that are able to obviously form relationships or have a support system, do have much better success and outcomes. Very, very, in particular, that's very specific also to the Latinx population, right? Latinx population, where the relationship that they build with providers in the context of the world and the words and the way that they've experienced the world, whether that's through their immigration journey, whether that's through being a first or second generation immigrant to this country, and or whether that's somebody that was born in this country that has a phenotypical traits that are of darker color, where they then get portrayed as other in their own country where they were born here, right? And I can speak for myself, those experiences. The last bullet here that we talk about is, in certain cultures, we also have to understand that words and the use of words can only be shared or used within sacred spaces. And that's very specific to when I look at the context of the world that I live in within New Mexico. And in New Mexico, I believe we're truly blessed to have the world around us with 18 pueblos and tribes surrounding us, the Navajo Nation as well, and the Apache, Mescalero Apache in our neighbors, right? And we have to see that as we see this through the lens of providers out in Florida, in your neck of the woods as well, right? Indigenous or Native communities, how do they interpret the world? We have to recognize, and I must recognize, the fact that I still sit and present to you today on stolen land from the Pueblo and the Navajo, and those that were pushed out of their land from colonization on the Long Walk, and many Pueblos and tribes and nations experiencing the Long Walk in their own way through colonization. We have to understand that this has created a certain contextual meaning for those individuals. Even more specific cultural and historical meaning that we have to understand comes into play when it comes to someone seeking service, someone engaging in services with someone that may look different from them in terms of the race, the ethnic group, the socioeconomic status, all those factors that typically, as providers, don't necessarily match up between us as the provider and the client that we're seeing, right? And when I say that, we have to understand that there's a hierarchy that is in place within the United States, right? Many would say that that's based on a caste system that was brought over during Spanish colonization, or the colonization by Spain. So contextual meaning, understanding the region that you're in, the clients that are coming to you, and the way that they start to assign meaning through words and through their emotions and experiences based on the spaces that they've experienced. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically about that here in just a minute. So Bakhtin talks about this very eloquently, and he's somebody that comes from the world of education. So any of you out there that are in the world of education, this is an author that really talks about language use, right? And I want to start to look at language, and that's how we will start to see the next several slides formulate our way of thinking, or how we ask you to think about language use, and then how we start to think about literacy in the way that we're trying to ask you to think about a little bit more in depth here. So language in two genres, right? The primary and the secondary genres. Primary is typically spoken and the secondary is typically written. So we come to understand language through our first encounters with our family, our caretaker, whoever we grew up around who started to communicate with us, right? So we're taking some steps back in early infancy development and early childhood development, language acquisition. Secondary genres are those that we learn to write, and I think as we start to learn the experience of students in schools, it's their understanding of the written word as it pertains to those who decide on the language and the way it's going to be taught, that are typically not responsive or reflective of the students that they teach. So what I mean is, schools are typically run by dominant groups that create a mechanism, a school system, a institution that is meant to create the same language use and the same meaning for all of those students that go through those doors and walk through the hallways of schools. So it's doing what it's intended to do. Now, what we as mental health providers should not be doing, I don't believe, is perpetuating that, is only allowing clients to speak English at our program. Again, if we are truly responsive to our needs, following the code of ethics and standards that we're going to look at here with regard to CLAS, C-L-A-S, we have to understand that that's an ethical responsibility, right? So here we're not talking about necessarily, but I think maybe I should say it because I don't want to assume, but we have to provide access to services in the primary language that our clients speak, right? Not the secondary, which is typically English. Primary, so Spanish, or if we're looking at other clients that are coming to our need, our clinical services that we provide to serve their needs, right? We're looking at this language in ways that, how are we able to do that? And nowadays, there's many ways to get language interpreter services as a paid service for your agency if you're having trouble accessing that through Medicaid or through other services or other channels. There's ways that we should be able to seek that if we are not able to hire somebody that speaks the language of the clients that we are serving. And no, it shouldn't be that we recruit the janitor or the custodian or anybody else that is not in a therapist or a service delivery role to be the interpreter, let alone family members or children of the clients that we're serving, right? That to me, I believe is unethical. And if we're looking at that, I understand through kind of a rural or a frontier approach to mental health provisions. I think we have to really think about that and access services maybe through teletherapy or telemedicine if you're not able to provide someone directly in-house to provide that language interpretation services. We have to understand in secondary genres, when we look at the interrelations between primary and secondary genres, the process of historical formulation of the latter shed light on the nature of utterance, and above all, the complex problem of the interrelations among language, ideology, and worldview, right? So the way that I understand and interpret Bakhtin's explanation here is that he is trying to shed light on the fact that the utterances and the way that we string words and letters together to create words and meanings and sentences and paragraphs and oral histories and stories are connected to history and to the historical experience of the client populations that we're serving. We have to understand, though, that sometimes if that's the dominant language that we're trying to use to shed a light on things, that there is interrelations among language, ideology, and worldview, but there may be also conflicts in that we have to resolve with our client population and the clients that we're served or communities that we serve. So Bakhtin is a really good reference. It is in our reference section of this presentation. I think he's someone to definitely think about when you're really trying to understand and take a deeper dive into language use and its meaning contextually. The other piece to this that we see, for example, that I want to share with you, and just to kind of put this in context of Bakhtin's explanation, is that many Latinx populations, the history of colonization, the immigration journey of the generations before them and or generation or their own journey, their experience with acculturation, and the way they interpret the United States all inform the way they read the world. So when we look at the discourse that's put out by media, And there's a really good textbook. See if I have it handy. Yes, I do. So the textbook, News for All the People, The Epic Story of Race in the American Media, written by Juan Gonzalez and Joseph Torres, is an excellent read. And it definitely is on the thicker end of our textbooks or books, but it really does, in a very, very eloquent way, highlight the language use and history of the way that newspapers, media, TV outlets has framed Latinx and the brown population, people of color, black and brown bodies in the United States. And it is very breathtaking to really understand how this government strategically and tactfully framed the way that they wanted to create conflicts between dominant groups and minorities, and or those groups that are on the fringes in our society, especially in the United States. And we see that playing out with the discourse around immigration, around immigrants, and we're going to look at that here in just a little bit. So think about the immigration journey. Think about the oral histories that is very connected to Latinx populations and indigenous and groups of color, where stories of discrimination and colonization are the legacies of that colonization that are passed forward and are passed on to future generations. And that becomes a lens through which our clients and the clients that we serve or communities we serve within our region come to read and interpret the world. And if we're missing that piece, we may not build the relationship that we need in order for clients to really engage, for clients not to drop out of services early because they're not feeling as though they're being heard or listened to or understood. They're really showing, and when we look at, if you have early termination with the Latinx population within the service or services you provide, maybe we're not paying attention to the utterances, symbols, and systems that they're presenting to us. Maybe we're not interpreting how they're reading the world through our assessments, through our use of, and another tool that's very important, the cultural formulation interview tool that's a part of the DSM and the appendices. And I apologize, I at one time had that page number referenced, but and in my memory, but since I'm out of clinical work directly, I haven't done those assessments in a while. But adapting the cultural formulation interview in the DSM to really try to get an understanding of how clients are interpreting and reading the world really will help you in your literacy development and also in assigning meaning through the systems and the idioms of distress that we talk about in our cultural elements training, that really helps clinicians and providers understand what symptoms and physical symptoms and others are experienced by clients. Now, how does each client and or family read the world? What does the world around them tell them about their existence? Bell Hooks talks about othering and the way that systems and institutions and governments other people in our society. And it's usually, if you look at the headlines, and one of the pieces that I want to expand upon on this, but it's very evident, if you just look at the headlines and just do a search, Google search on immigration news headlines over the last month, 2 months, 3 months, and just take a look at how our media puts groups of color in conflict with each other. Puts people here in the United States at odds with immigrants who are trying to seek asylum because of the violence they're experiencing in their home country, right? What does the world and the system and the institutions send meaning, and what is that meaning? How does that meaning take shape, I should say, for those clients that are presenting to us? Is it clients presenting with anxiety and depression? Clients or clinicians experiencing, clients reporting experiences around suicide and not feeling hopeful about the future? Well, perhaps it's the discourse that is embedded within the systems that we have in place. So I want to take just a second, and Cindy, if you can just manage the chat, if you don't mind, and I will as well. But I just want to open it up if there's any questions at this point. I know we're kind of right about the midpoint, so I want to make sure, and it'll give me a chance to wet my throat here just a little bit as well. But any questions that come up for anybody initially as we're looking at these first few slides? All right, so I don't see anything in the chat thus far, and that's okay. No, that's not a problem. I hope that you guys do ask some questions at the end. I'm also gonna, while I'm here and while we're checking in with each other, I'm gonna go ahead and put my email address in the chat. I want to make sure you all are aware that we have several presentations that we do for the community. We are 100% funded through SAMHSA and other grant funding, and we are able to provide different sorts of trainings adapted to your community and or agency needs around some of the stuff we're talking about today, around direct service work. Right now, we're excited to be a part of helping to address unaccompanied minors in our communities as well. And I think that kind of gives me a good segue to really illustrate also, think about the unaccompanied minors that are coming through our borders now as well, and all of the messages and the experience and the social media content, the messages that are being uttered to them through the guards who are keeping watch over them as I call them, prisoners. Let's not kid ourselves, folks. From the experiences that have been shared with us from people who have experienced these holding cells and these facilities that are transitioning unaccompanied minors into United States, they're really, really poor conditions. And we have to understand, how are those individuals that are coming through those systems now going to interpret and read the world that they're now experiencing and coming to? And let me be very clear, folks, that the views that I hold, I really do hold as a proud United States citizen, but at the same time as a critical thinking citizen that really thinks about our system and our government and the atrocities that we've perpetuated against indigenous and native communities in this country, and the way that we continue to treat immigrants and people of color in this country. I think we can do better. And I know that unless we start to talk about it, and unless us as citizens that have a platform and a circle of influence to impact don't talk about it, we'll never get to a place where we can see things change. So look around you and see the systems that you have around you to be able to really think about how can you really now take a look at the world through some different lenses as we evolve here through our presentation. So thinking about utterances, symbols, systems, I want to really make sure that we think about, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. We do have a question and a comment. You were asking for those a minute ago, so let me just read the question. It says, feeling and thinking in one language and speaking and reading in another produces complexity and behavior and cognitive uncertainty, even modifying the way of perceiving everyday interaction. What do you think?
That's an excellent point, and I think that reminds us that many of our students and clients and families that are immigrating to our country, and or our first or second generation immigrants to this country, have these competing discourse coming at them, right? When I talk about competing discourse, it's discourse that's coming into them from the United States in the way of media, social media, TV that they watch, newspapers that they read, articles, magazines, whatever sort of discourse they consume, radio. Those are things that we can't get away from. Now, what does that do to also create this kind of either biculturalism or ambioculturalism, where sometimes these cultures are conflicting with each other? So I definitely try to encourage agencies and clinicians that can provide services in the language, the primary language that the client or speaks, is going to get a lot more contextual meaning from that interaction than providing language in a secondary or interaction in a secondary language. So to your point, I think it definitely is something that we should try to reconcile. And a lot of times that'll help us to understand the meaning in its true essence when we talk about Bakhtin's, outline of contextual meaning in language. Thank you for that. That's awesome. Alrighty, I think that was it. And then please don't hesitate, Cindy, to jump in here. I don't know, no worries about interrupting. So again, the utterances, symbols, and systems, right? One thing that we have to think about, and the ideas that Miles Myers talks about, is the ideas of English and English language are to grow out of the domains of literature and public discourse, just like I mentioned. And Gonzalez and Torres, in their News for All the People, the epic story of race in the American media, do an excellent job to frame this. Commercials, TV, public debates and panels, cereal boxes, newspapers, posters, magazines, and are expressed in the concepts of love, hate, envy, and friendship. So what I really liked about this quote and looking at Miles Myers is the relationship that he starts to create between emotion and discourse, right? And we have to understand that at times we should be very cautious that we always want to pathologize, or because it's the nature of what we do, it's what we do, right? We're clinicians. We start to clinically assess always, okay, what's going on with this person? Maybe we should look at this as a way to reconcile and look at contextual meaning and the overdose of discourse that people consume, to the fact that maybe the discourse that they're consuming is what's creating anxiety, what's creating depression, what's creating symptoms of ataque de nervios, right? Attack of the nerves, or feeling overwhelmed with the discourse, because that discourse paints you and your family and your children as brown and black families as enemy, as criminal, as alien, right? And when we see that discourse, public discourse, really connect with emotions, we maybe start to see some of those emotions play out, and we definitely need to be considerate of not always pathologizing or diagnosing that. Maybe it's about resolving some of those conflicts that I explained. So language matters, and our view of the world matters, right? I'm sure many of you have seen this. This is not a new or any sort of trivial sort of a picture, but it just reminded me of exactly as it says, how we see the world depends on how we look. And that then in turn will then play out in how we paint the world and how we create meaning in the world, of the world that we are surrounded by, right? So I think about the way that language use is used within the media and within the discourse that we see around immigration policy in this country, and the fact that the immigration policy experts that are more opposed to immigrants coming into this country, whether it's through asylum and or other means, legal or not, are against people of color immigrating to this country, because the way that they present it to us is they're going to take our jobs. They don't contribute, when in fact they contribute billions of dollars a year to our tax base. But our government, those that want to kind of push immigration policy away and not deal with it, but really put people in prisons, we then see those individuals pushing away from the fact and not pulling in the data that shows how much immigrants contribute to this country and have since its creation. we truly look at it, we're all immigrants to this country. Unless you're indigenous or Native American, we're all immigrants in one sort or fashion. So the way that I break this down, and I think some of you, I hope, may have attended a presentation that I've done called the intersections of institutional racism and mental health. And when we look at institutional racism, school personnel and providers, we have to know that and we should throw in there agency leaders, right, administrators, may exacerbate mental health symptoms for Latinx communities if we're not paying attention to our language use, to the social and institutional discourse that we push out to the community, like advertising, commercials, radio ads, pamphlets and brochures, the art and the pictures that you have hanging up in your office space, right? Your Facebook posts and the things that you put out there. All levels of discourse, and that's why I'm really excited. I was telling my wife yesterday or today before coming on how happy I am and honored and humbled that I'm really now able to combine my expertise with clinical and mental health work, addiction, with my doctoral studies, which really examine language and literacy through a critical race lens. And being able to do that in a way that now helps me to point out to you as providers and to community members, parents, leaders in our community, that the language we use matters, and it may create and exacerbate mental health symptoms, anxiety, depression, hopelessness. Racial microaggressions that uses language and discourse may be perpetuating and exacerbating mental health systems. And then, of course, explicit racism, right? And I don't believe that we can pull out, don't get me wrong, there's physical acts of violence that is a result of racism. But usually those physical acts of violence, in my interpretation through a critical race lens and critical discourse analysis lens, is one that will say the law and the written word that put the weapon in those individual and group members' hands to then go out and carry out colonization and discrimination is what led to systematic and institutional racism, right? Not just the system was created and it's now all of a sudden going to be racist, or the individual now is just all of a sudden racist, right? They were taught those things through the use of language and through the use of the discourse that they consumed as a young child, as someone that grew up with whatever sort of experiences made them look at races in a discriminatory way and a separative way. And not that that's hard to find, folks. The government does a really good job of pitting us as groups of color against each other, as dominant groups, as white members of the dominant group, Anglo, however we want to call our dominant group in the United States, that's now kind of shifting, right, to Latin and a darker shade of brown, if you will. Our government continues to pit dominant groups against people of color. And unless we're hip to the game and smart enough to read the language and the way that literacy is used and meant to perpetuate further disruption, we may be missing it, and we may be, to a degree, brainwashed, if you will, with all the rhetoric and use of language through discourse that we see. So to explain this a little bit more, language matters, again, and kind of continuing that theme. But practices could not take shape without language, right? So using language, the language that then creates the discourse and rhetoric, can be used to continue to oppress minorities and further perpetuate the dichotomy of us versus them. Us versus them, we have to understand, is the strategy that dominant groups and groups that have colonized this country and other countries around the world have used an us and them dichotomy to pit groups of color against each other, right? This is very significant, and again, a long-term strategy of races and racism to divide and conquer. If groups of color are more divided than they are unified, chances are the dominant group has a better chance to conquer those groups. And we've seen that done over time, right? Some examples, contemporary examples, I should say, from the highest officials in our government, right, using language. And this presentation was done during the previous administration's time in office, the previous 4 years, but their language matters. Language matters. And examples of that is when we call and refer to people seeking asylum because of violence and war and poverty and famine in their countries, come to seek asylum in the United States because they're hopeful for a better life for themselves, their kids, their family, they're labeled criminal. They're labeled illegal alien. They're labeled illegal immigrants, violent protesters, versus those fine people. Remember that? That discourse matters. And if you don't think it matters, look at how that discourse of our former president, how that kind of rang a bell and chimed and really resonated with a lot of white nationalists and people that really seek to oppress minorities in this country. When we start to use labels, again, protesters or peaceful protesters against those people, against criminals, those kids, right, them, the use of language in even the way that we approach inclusion and equity, when we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion approaches, that really means that we look at how we use language. If we're using language like those kids or them over there instead of us or we, it creates an experience and it creates emotions, as we talked about earlier with Myers, right? As he mentioned, looking at it through this way that discourse creates emotion and meaning for people. When we look at social and institutional language, the policies that are created, right? So the use of language in policy matter, because if we didn't have policy, we wouldn't have the practices, right? And to a degree, maybe these two things should be swapped. But the way that we outline this presentation, it makes sense the way that it's set up here. However, you could put, again, the policies that are created then inform and create the practices, right? To a degree. However, I believe that through learned behavior, many times people who are discriminatory or racist or oppressive towards minorities or the Latinx population, they also learn those behaviors potentially through other mechanisms, whether that was school, family, or otherwise. So us versus them, we talked about that. It also has a lot to do when we look at policies and the use of language in resource allocation, right? Us versus them, theirs versus ours. The order of the race groups in a document matter, especially when we're looking at policy analysis. And that was what a lot of my dissertation and research has been on, is looking at historical documents that not only replicate and reify a racial hierarchy, but based on that racial hierarchy, those in power that are at the top of the racial hierarchy and race chain, or food chain, I should say as well, have the ability to then create policies that benefit them long term. And when we see those policies being implemented and instituted legislatively into legal discourse, it then becomes cemented into our practices as a country, as a community, as a county, as a city. So we ask ourselves, and we must ask ourselves, if we're looking at this through a lens of language and literacy accusation and contextual meaning, what does the document that I'm looking at, the policy, say about the racial groups that it's supporting? Does it exclude certain groups? Does it label certain groups first before other groups, minority groups potentially, dominant group at the beginning, racial and minority groups lower in that priority? Because we know, and Bell Hooks talks about this, we know through othering groups within policy as legal discourse, it really cements people and people of color's place in society since colonization. And if we're not critically looking at those policies that provide resources in terms of financial resources, in terms of access to services, access to care, then potentially we're perpetuating a divide and conquer strategy, right? By not including and creating equity within our programming, within our language use. And I can't say enough. A lot of my work with, especially with teens and young adults, comes from schools. So this definitely includes schools. When we see schools in our lower socioeconomic status communities that don't have a lot of resources, and we solely see those individuals from the armed services coming in to recruit our young Latinx population to the armed services to serve their country, instead of colleges and universities and other maybe vocational trades even coming in to recruit those kids. We know that there's certain things in that school that are perpetuating a hierarchy within workforce development. So I'm just trying to provide some of those examples. Furthermore, when we look at that through a school tracking lens, right? AP students, or those students that we see that are college bound or are in dual enrollment programs, they're going to not only community college or college in junior and senior year of high school, but they're also attending classes that are AP credit, and they get credit, college credits, right? When we look at special education and the attendee that mentioned how difficult it is sometimes to create meaning in one language compared to maybe your primary language as an immigrant or as somebody who their primary language is Spanish, those kids often are put into special education courses or labeled as special education students, at least in New Mexico and in many schools that I've taught about or talked about and met with across the country, where these students, because of their primary language use and primary language being English, that not being prominent and as sharp and as perfect as it should be, yet in their home countries, when they were taught in their primary language, these students may have been A and B students. They're now labeled and put into special education classes, right? So when we talk about language and policies, this is where we start to see how that then creates a mechanism for profiling and for tracking these students long term. Some of the racial microaggressions, and this comes from the work of Lee. Dr. Lee talks about racial microaggressions, micro assaults, micro insults. And to give you a very broad and brief examples of those, here's a few. When we talk about people of color, and maybe it's a student, maybe it's a client you serve, maybe it's an administrator that you introduce to a client, and they talk to this client and they say, "Oh, you speak very well. Where are you from?" Many times, they're not talking about, "Oh, where do you come from in our community? What part of our state do you come from? What region in the United States?" They're talking about, "What foreign country do you come from?" They're othering that person almost right off the bat without even inquiring. And I've had that experience. I was born in the United States. I've lived here all my life. Primary language is English. I speak Spanish, poco choppy, a little broken, but at the same time, I've gotten asked that, and I am someone that comes from experience and privilege and opportunity, right, through being able to go to doctoral school. I've been asked at times when I go to do presentations, oh, are you the presenter, or when is the presenter coming? Right? And sometimes I have to break their heart and say, well, I'm sorry, I'm the one they gave you this time, right? But when people are asking those sort of questions, where are you from? It's usually not in reference to what part of the community you come from, or making comments like you speak good English, thinking that that's a comment that is um, supportive or complimentary, is really putting that person in a position where they feel like you're othering them, and that creates an experience for them, a contextual meaning, if you will, like we talked about in the first half of this training. Other microaggressions, micro insults that Lee talks about is talking behind a person, students, clients, families' back to other professionals or staff about racial identifiers or stereotypes, but you're unwilling to speak directly to the person, students, clients, or family or families, right? Those can be considered racial microaggressions if they are in a way that is discriminatory and or classifying people and or othering people, right? Passing notes or talking when a person of color is speaking without giving them your attention. Sometimes we see those as passive aggressive behaviors. Lee would call those micro insults or microaggressions, and he talks about those through a kind of a body language view of things. And as you all know, we as Latinx populations, and those of you that come from Latinx populations or are members of those racial groups, you know that we tend to be very touchy, feely, want to hug kind of people, want to connect. And sometimes microaggressions through body language can be very insulting as well. If somebody puts kind of an arm up or doesn't want to give a hug, side hug, or whatever is appropriate for your environment. Now, obviously with COVID, that's going to impact a lot of things. But think about racial microaggressions. Think about how we approach people of color, how we speak to them, how we approach them in a way that may be assuming a lot of times. People make comments, and sometimes these may be cliche in ways, but it's true. When we talk about people of dominant groups coming up to people of color, Black, African American, Native, indigenous, and telling them, oh, I love your hair, or you have beautiful hair, and touching it. And that, folks, may be sincere. It may be sincere, and it may be a good gesture, but you have to know the historical and contextual meaning of some of those things. We here contemporarily in the last 2 years in Albuquerque have had teachers who have actually cut the hair off of a Native American student and made other racial comments to other students, other teachers have, like savage Indians and those sort of comments. In 2020, folks, 2019, right? That's unacceptable, and that is not okay. Those are direct racial and racism, and are not anything micro about those. But when we connect the contextual meaning of those acts to the experience of certain children because of their race, because of the color of their skin, because of the phenotypical traits that have been given to them through birth and through hereditary type of means, yet people in dominant groups have racialized those phenotypical traits and characters, right? When we talk about minstrel shows and the exaggeration of lips and eyes and hair texture in media and in historical discourse that our community and society and government has put out there to portray people of color, we then know how these microaggressions then come to be very painful. So please understand that. A colorblind ideology as well does not make things any better. Saying I see people, I don't see color does not make things any better. I'm sorry to break it to you. But it reifies and perpetuates systems of othering, right? If you don't see someone's race, typically you're dismissing the contextual meaning of what their racial experience entailed. Let me say that again. If you're dismissing and saying, I don't see race or I don't see color, you're dismissing an individual's contextual meaning and experience with the history and their experience in this community, in society, in our United States, right? And that can play out even further when we look at explicit racism. So explicit racism may look like racial profiling and discrimination. It may look like, again, when we look at policies, broken window policing, where in all schools, all instances of misconduct are referred to probation or the courts, where how many of you remember, and I have to speak out for myself, how many of you remember ISS or in-school suspensions, right? Or having to stay after school and clean the chalk, they called erasers or the chalkboards, right? Those were ways that we were trying to create positive behaviors or impact behaviors within schools. Now, with zero tolerance policies, these kiddos are referred to probation and created a record for them that's then tracked, right? I'll give you one example that I always use because it's very simple, and to me it's like this kiddo was referred to probation in our community, and I was doing some social work with the schools at that time for jumping up in the hallway and touching one of the ceiling tiles, and the corner of the ceiling tile broke off. Was that wrong of the individual? Yes. Should he be jumping in the hallways? No. Is that a part of normal teen adolescent development? In my mind, absolutely. Right? Basketball players, athletes, challenging each other, jumping up and touching banners, jumping up and trying to touch the net in the gymnasium. And is there an appropriate time for that? Absolutely. The gym, physical education class, PE, whatever. But to give this young Latino Hispanic person a record with juvenile probation and have him have to go to a session for 3 hours, have his parents miss 3 hours of work, which they don't get paid for, and it looks bad on their attendance at work, right? For a job that they need, and they have to have them miss work to go do that, then starts to create this involvement with the system. And it starts to create a way of academic and, I would say, police tracking, right? So these are some of the explicit racism type of things that we see in our communities. And folks, we could be here all day, right? This slide is just a reminder of how some of the language use and our interpretation and our clients' interpretation of how they read the world impacts not only microaggressions, but direct racism and explicit racism in general. The last bullet here is very important. Militarized police, policing in schools, having metal detectors in schools, having police officers with guns and badges, and wearing what is it called? Sorry, I'm drawing a blank. Bulletproof vests and armor and stuff, right? We saw through the riots throughout the last year in the uprising, and I would just say, instead of us calling them riots, maybe social uprising, social discourse playing out. People of color taking to the streets to express the fact that our government and our system does not respond to them through legal, other than to lock them up and incarcerate them. And the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander does an excellent job in creating an understanding of all that I'm talking about today, in how our government has created a way to criminalize the brown and black body from the school to prison pipeline, and other policies like the ones I mentioned here that continue to perpetuate legacies of colonization and continue to perpetuate racism in our United States. And I'm not saying, please don't get me wrong, folks, I'm not saying that we shouldn't match the same force that we get from militant groups and those that want to oppress and want to create hate in the United States and oppress others, because we have to meet that firepower with the same firepower, I guess, until we learn other ways of more peaceful healing and ways to heal our communities. But these are explicit ways that we see racism playing out, that it just gives you an idea of what's happening in my community, what's happening in my school, what are the systems that my clients are involved in, school, community agencies, probation, parole, whatever, that then comes to my community-based agency that I then have to interpret their contextual meaning and the way that they read the world, right? It helps to put that in kind of a more specific cultural meaning. We always have to add some additional reminders, right? I think we all should be doing a self-reflective inventory of where we are in terms of addressing our own biases and prejudices, our own racist acts, microaggressions, micro-insults, body language that is closed off to other racial groups, other racial clients, colleagues that we serve and serve with. But we know here on the far left, cultural destructiveness in the red. If you're in the red, chances are you're pushing the red line, as I like to reference automobiles in that, and you're overheating, you're angry, you're upset. You've seen a lot of changes in the United States over the last several years, and we see the, what can we say, longitudinal estimation of brown and black faces being the dominant group in the United States. So you may be someone right now who is really feeling overwhelmed with that your rights, that your privileges are being infringed upon. You may feel overwhelmed and in the orange, but still maintaining racism and stereotypes, maybe not looking and calling out unfair hiring practices, or if you're in a role where you can hire somebody, choosing someone from a white dominant group rather than from a group of color, even though the person in the group of color has the same exact skill set, maybe even better and more proficient at the job than the one from the dominant group. Cultural blindness, right? This is where we see colorblind ideology, ignoring and treating everyone the same. This typically only meets the needs of dominant groups, right? And it really does nothing for equity. Equity work does not mean giving everybody the same kind of box to stand on that's the same height, right? It means that if there's a group or cultural group within our United States and in our communities that needs 2 boxes rather than 1 box to stand on in order to have the same kind of vantage point when we do that. Because we know in this country, through redlining, through taxation, through many other practices of the government in this country, and if you want to review a documentary that really illustrates this, it is Race, the Power of an Illusion, is a great way to look at the policies that historically have framed and benefited the dominant group in this country and has really made them to generate more revenue and long-term financial success than groups of color based on policy that was in place as we began this country. Cultural pre-competence, you're exploring. Maybe this is your first kind of exploration in getting outside of your comfort zone. However, you're committed and you're willing to assess the needs of your organization. You as a professional who does continuing education, professional development, and cultural proficiency. You implement changes then as you get to cultural competence and proficiency, you start to recognize individual and cultural differences, you seek advice, and then you implement those changes to improve services. So I'm looking at our time now. We have about 20 minutes, so I'm going to get through this, but I wanted to kind of give you this in a way that you can reference this document as well. I'll try before our time and day to put in the chat if I can drag it in there real quick. But looking at class standards, and this is where all of what we've talked about today is kind of put together in a way that federal agencies have now looked at this in ethical and code of conduct standards and lenses to really make sure that we're looking culturally, linguistically at appropriate services, right? So providing culturally and linguistic appropriate services is what the class standard and class standards are. So if you do a research and a study, a Google search, do OMH and look at class standards, and that will bring you to the report. And that report, if I have a few minutes here, I'll share it with you, really highlights in your state what your state is doing around class standards. It's actually pretty cool, and it'll give you more information. But what the Enhanced National Standards for Culturally and Linguistically Appropriate Services in Healthcare are issued by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Minority Health. And they're meant to advance health equity, improve quality, and eliminate healthcare disparities through establishing a blueprint, if you will, for appropriate cultural and linguistic services. The principal standard, and there's 15 standards total, but the one that we kind of pulled out, or I pulled out to provide for you today, is we want to provide effective, equitable, understandable and respectful quality care and services that are responsive to diverse cultural health beliefs and practices, preferred languages, health literacy, right? And health literacy does not always mean Western medicine health literacy. Health literacy may be traditional healers, curanderas, spiritual healers, medicine men and women, and other communication needs, like we talked about through literacy, the way that they interpret and understand the world. So this declaration and these standards really puts out there that federally funded programs should adhere to the class standards. Who enforces this? Well, we do, right? There's not a class standards police. Office on Minority Health isn't sending out the police to go, the class standards police to go audit programs. But I think us as professionals, as professionals that adhere to code of ethics and certain standards, we should be those advocates that enforce this, right? We should be the ones that call out programs that aren't providing services in the language, aren't providing services at the literacy level and at the contextual meaning and understanding of the client populations that they're serving. They're trying to fit them in a one-size cookie cutter type of format. So we are the ones that enforce this. The 4 aspects that I want to really highlight for you all is implementation and recommendations of class standards. So increase the depth, clarity, and concrete action steps in your strategic planning around class standards. Make needs assessments a priority. Hopefully you can use them to drive strategic planning and activities, again, to implement your class standards and conduct frequently, review those frequently enough where you can correct action and address those if you're not meeting the standards that are outlined. The third one here, incorporate evaluation of patient and population outcomes, satisfaction surveys, evaluating your client progress and success. Number 4, assess the extent to which cultural and linguistic competency efforts are guided by your framework. So it's always that check and balance, right? Auditing, very similar to auditing your programs around ASAM criteria and best practices. Include class standards around that. And then 5th, consider dissemination of class standards in the implementation activities by using that framework of those standards through developing your website, creating of resources, your brochures, your reports, and of course, as it mentioned here, through your strategic planning. So there's I think, really good 5 very good ways that you can start to think about this, right? As your agency, your institution, government entity thinks about class standards. These are a few of the references, like I mentioned, Bakhtin, Myers, and then also, of course, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. That is where the document that I'm going to show you right now comes from. And then I want to highlight on May 14th, a Latinx Mental Health Summit that the Mental Health and Technology Transfer Center is sponsoring. There is a registration link here and a QR code if you want to take a snapshot of that real quickly on your screen. Dr. Luis Torres and Inma Iglesias is going to start that off, and we're really excited about that. So please register and continue to stay in contact with us. And then lastly here, your opinion matters. So we ask you to please follow the link here on SurveyMonkey, or take a snapshot of the QR code and please conduct that, complete that survey. That is what is able to allow us to bring you these trainings free of charge, and really able to give us feedback on how we can continue to provide great trainings that are meeting your needs, right? Thank you to our director, Dr. Ives Carrion, our project manager, Angel Casillas, all of our team there at the MHTTC. And then before I leave, I want to share with you, let me give you one more thing here. And I'm hopeful. Well, actually, I'm going to reference this, and then I'm going to take some questions, because I want to at least give you guys 10 or 12 minutes to ask some questions. So the reference that I shared with you all, and then I'll go to Cindy to see if there's any questions in the chat. Please let us know if there is, and we will also make sure that we post this for you or send this out to you. But it's very easy to reference. If you just go to OHI and you look at National Standards for Cultural and Linguistic Appropriate Services, you will get this handout and pamphlet. And I want to end by saying thank you so much for your time with me today. Like I said, I'm very thankful to the MHTTC for allowing me to kind of bring in language literacy into the way that we look at it through the lens of mental health services and through the provision of services. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it back to Cindy. Please let me know if there's any other questions. If not, we'll go ahead and end our time for today. But Cindy, anything that you can see there?
Yeah, we do have a question.
All right.
It's a little bit long, so I'm gonna go ahead and read it. It says, inserting oneself into the competitive aggressive dynamics in the search for money on retirement plans also produces cognitive distortion for the migrant population. A large proportion of them, and they did not expect to be in such dynamic and competitive environment full of type A personality. Without being able to communicate effectively, the command of language could modify the style of their own stories and experiential effectiveness.
Oh, that's an excellent statement. It sounds like a statement, but I'll kind of just give some of my feedback based on what that was. It's, I think what you're saying is at times when we as advocates go into certain cultural groups, organizational culture, institutional cultures, sometimes the leadership in those roles are dominant A personalities, and we may not have the, as Derek Bell talks about, the repertoire of responses that we need in order to effectively communicate what our clients' needs are from a equity standpoint, a DEI standpoint, if you will. I think that's true. However, you now have a MHTTC center to connect with, to get a small army of advocates behind you, right? Not only the MHTTC, the National Hispanic Latino Center, but there's 10 sites around the country. Look for the one in your region and see how we can help you all. I think yours is the Northeast and Caribbean, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, out in Florida. But reach out to us as advocates, because we can then help you to develop a way to approach those type A personalities in order to give you some movement, give you some traction, give you that support. Look at that through a way of saying, hey, legally, federally funded programs should be adhering to class standards. So you now have some policy to also use in your favor to maybe help get you some traction. The last thing that I'll say is I would also continue to advocate, continue to develop your repertoire. And one training that we see in the addiction and mental health world is motivational interviewing. Sometimes using motivational interviewing strategies and tactics in terms of getting other organizational leaders and others to agree and to sometimes think it was kind of their idea in the first place at the end of the conversation. there's ways to utilize motivational interviewing to your advantage. And many corporations and organizations are now using motivational strategies in their business practices. So think about that in a broad perspective as well. I think that's all as far as that feedback. Cindy, anything else that you can see out there?
We have a couple of like comments more than question actually. So I'll just go ahead and read those to you. The first one says, and this was more or less at the beginning of the training, someone was sharing that in their clinic, they also use adaptation of the CFI during their clinical interview.
Awesome, that's great. Great to hear. Absolutely, and keep in mind, folks, adaptation should be done with most standardized instruments, right, or evidence-based models. And I'm really happy to say that MHTTC can help with that adaptation if you need that support. That's awesome. That's great to hear.
And then the other comment just basically is thanking you for the presentation, that it was very informative, and that the information is really relevant to education. They wish that school district would have more presentations like this one.
Awesome, thank you. We'll reach out. We also have, as was talked about in the introduction, we also have a school-based mental health curriculum that really talks about a task force and creating movement and advocacy. And we definitely could talk to your school about how we do this or come do this training at your school. So reach out to us. We'd be more than willing to support you.
Yes, thank you, Rocky. And I also added our links to the chat because we've been getting questions about the recording of this webinar, and it's going to be available both on our website and YouTube channel. And I went ahead and added those to the chat. Yeah, but we don't have any more questions or comments.
All right. Well, I just want to thank everybody for their time. Thank you to the MHTTC. Thank you, Cindy and Dr. Miranda, for the introduction and moderation. And I just want to thank you all for giving me an hour or so of your time. It's meaningful, and I thank you for allowing us to share some space and really be able to think about things a little bit differently. If we can support you, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll see you later. Signing out from Albuquerque. Thanks, Cindy.